Hi there, Sue's here. I've just come off of Create and Craft doing a show with Andy Skinner using lots of his lovely new products, and I was showing a card on there as my last demo, and it was a bit of a rush, so I thought what I'd do is, while I've got all the bits and pieces out and I've got my camera ready and my little thingy here, I thought I would do a quick tutorial on how I made that card for anybody that's interested. So here we go. Okay, so here we go. This is what we're aiming for, but this time, instead of using the granite embossing powder, I'm going to use raspberry ice cream. This gives a slightly whiter effect, and so it just means it stands out from the background even more than I've made it do with the shading. So let me show you how I made this. First of all, took a piece of white card, a damp sponge, which I've squeezed out really hard in a piece of kitchen towel, and then I just dab into the cobalt teal hue, which is one of Andy's paints here, cobalt teal hue, and it looks quite dark in the pot, doesn't it? But because I'm using it on a damp sponge, it almost gives it more of a, it's like it stains the card instead of painting it. The other benefit of doing this is that it just means it dries super quick, and it gives you a really flat surface if you're a bit nervous with stamping. Now, I'd be quite happy with that. A few lighter patches, I think, just gives a bit of interest to the back of the card, so that's not a problem. So I would leave it like that. What I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to come to a piece that I've actually pre-done. Oh, without whacking the camera. Now, I'll move my paint out of the way. It's a bit of a tight setup here because the camera's quite low so that you can see. So what I've done is I've got the stamp roughly in place. I've inked it up. I always ink my stamps with archival if I'm using a clear embossing powder like Perfect Medium, because then if I ink it with the black first and then go over with the clear sticky ink pads, whether it's Perfect Medium or Versamark, it means I can see if my image is transferred onto the card. If I don't do that, then I don't know if I've got the whole image. So that to me looks pretty adequate. So I'm going to go with that. But that is actually clear embossing powder, a clear embossing ink on there. So I'm going to get my scrap piece of card, and this got me quite a few giggles earlier, quite funny, Andy dressing up at the Ministry of Mixology, which is one of the art retreats that we do with Di Oliver and Tando. So I've got the embossed image. It's a bit off centre, but it doesn't really matter. Get my embossing powder, pour that on. Now you can see I've got some real big chunks in here, which I absolutely love. I've got something else in there as well, a bit of plastic. Nice. So when you're using this and you're using it on something slightly bigger, you want to give it a good shake, and you get all the big bits coming to the top and get a bit of a mixture then. So normally with an image like this you would use a detailed embossing powder, because there is so much detail on here. There's a danger that with really chunky powder you might lose some of the detail, but I'm not worried about that. I think it's going to look quite nice. So I'm just going to pour that on. I'm going to tip that down so it catches the whole of the image, and not too fast because I want to make sure that it actually sticks to the ink pad, to the card. Give that a little tap. Now if you've got bits like this, you can just rub those off. If you've used an anti-static pad beforehand, you shouldn't get too much excess around the image. I always use an anti-static pad before I do my stamping. So I'm going to say goodbye to Andy. Bye bye, Andy. And tip away the embossing powder. That was raspberry ice cream. Put the lid back on, and then heat emboss that image. Now I have got a pair of tweezers handy, so if the image gets too hot for me to hold, I will be able to pick it up with the tweezers. But I just want you to be able to see. I'm also going to put another light on. I think I've had to put the blinds down because the sun's come around and it's just so bright in this room. It shines directly in and you literally can't see anything. Hopefully that will help. So you should be able to see the transition between the powder and what it looks like when it melts. You don't need to go wafting the heat gun around like like you're in some sort of race. Just hold it steady, let the heat do the work, and then as it starts melting, just turn the card. If I couldn't turn the card, if it was a really big project, I would then just move the heat gun instead. And can you see all the colours coming out from that raspberry ice cream? I'm just starting to melt. So there you go, I've got the whole image there, and it's quite a variety, and you can see where the thicker chunks are down here, you get less detail than where the small chunks were down here. But I quite like that anyway. So I'm going to let that cool down for a second. While that's cooling down, I'm going to bring in my fly-free stencil. Now I did make another sample card for the shows with this, using the whole image, which was really lovely. I quite like that. But I do love these bubbles within this bird. So that's what I'm going to use now. And what I'm going to do is just bring back in my paint. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. And then I've got the sponge, which was, as I say, I'm going to make damp. So I'm dipping that into some water. And then I really want this sponge to be as dry as possible. The dampness just helps it work, it helps it move. It gives it a nice smoothness because it's quite a creamy paint, beautiful paint, very strong colours. So now I've got just a slightly damp sponge. I'm going to select an area, I think this sort of area of the stencil to work on. Now normally you would dab into a stencil because you're less likely to get bleed underneath if you do that, but I'm going to do a slightly different thing. I'm going to actually do a slightly circular motion, and the reason for that is if you do this you tend to get an edge on the edge of the circle because it seems to capture a bit more of the paint. I'll try not to overwork it because then I'll just end up with blobs. So okay, you can see that's worked a little bit there, and I'm going to do that all the way around. If I didn't like that, I'll show you how I would resolve that. So paint on, paint off, and sponge through. And then finally, still got plenty of paint on my sponge. I might have moved the stencil there, but hey ho. So if I thought that was all too messy, a very easy thing to do is just blend the whole thing out. And then what will happen is I can go back over it. These bubbles will then become part of the background, which is also quite nice. It gives a bit more depth to the image. So I'll go back in, my stencil. I'll use some of this time. The same principle, into the ink, the paint, off so that there's not too much. Hold the stencil down really firmly and just wiggle your sponge along it. And then lift off, and hopefully you get a few images that you can work with. I think those are quite okay. I'm just going to do a bit more here. Now don't worry if it looks a bit messy at this stage because we're going to pull out those shapes with some more colours. You do want to try not to move the stencil if you can avoid it at this point, but there you go. A couple more up here, I think. Okay, now I'm quite happy with that now. So I'm going to dry that off, and then I'm going to show you how we lift the main stamped image off of the background. Now I've actually got quite a bit of paint on the ink there, on the embossing powder. So I'm just going to come in and try and wipe that off. There you go, that's taken a bit of that off. So back to what I was doing, dry that off. You don't want to heat this too much at this stage, because if you overheat the embossing powder, it goes from a lovely shiny finish to a very dull kind of burnt look. So what I'm going to do now is come back in again using the Prussian blue. I think I might use Payne's grey there. Let's have a look. And then I've got a flat brush, and I've dipped that in water, and I'm just taking most of the water off of it, and I'm going in with the corner of my brush, so you can see the paint is only on one edge. Dip back in again. This is a technique called floating, and this is used in decorative painting. And hopefully you'll see as I work that by going round the edge of the image and pulling it out from the area behind it, it's sort of lifting it off the page. Can you see the difference? So I just work my way quickly around doing that. The other thing with this is you can do it in layers, so you don't, you can build up the intensity of the darkness underneath. And be fairly quick with this. Keep coming back in just on that corner. And work your way around until you're really happy that that is giving you a nice depth. It's quite dark over here, so I'm going to add a little bit more colour on this side using the same side of the brush. Until I'm happy that it's fairly balanced all the way around. Now, I'm quite happy with that. So rinse my brush off, because otherwise you ruin your brushes if you leave acrylic paints on them. And now what I'm going to do is work on the bubbles, because if you have a look back to this card, you can see that the bubbles are quite defined. Now the way to do that is to go back in with your stencil. Ideally to go back in with a clean stencil, otherwise you're in danger of smudging it underneath. And then try and pick out some of those areas. Now this is still a bit wet and this is still a bit wet, so I'll give that a quick dry. And using the same technique, I can actually go in with my brush, bit of water, dab it off onto a bit of kitchen towel, so it's not too wet. Change the colour there. It's okay. Again, go in with the corner. Just make sure that that's on one side of the brush. And then what I can do is, if I just show you on, say, this section, I can go around the bottom of the circles Another bit of shading just to those sections. There's already a little bit of shading because of the way that I use the sponge on the stencil. This will define some of those circles even more. And it's a really nice way of lifting these bubbles away from each other. So you just pick out a few which then appear like they're on top. Appear to be on top. And then you end up with a situation where it looks like you've got bubbles all floating above each other. And hopefully you can see that. There's a couple more here. And once you've gone round and done that and highlighted some of the bubbles, what you then want to do is go in at the final step and just add some highlights. But before I do that, I'm just going to take my sponge again with a bit of this paint and just go around the edge so that I hide any white bits. And this is something that people quite often do with distress inks, but it's very easy to do it with acrylic paints as well. You just need to make sure that you dry it before you do the next step. And when you go round and do something like this and frame your artwork, it does tend to pull the image in. Although I'm actually going to be layering this onto black cards, so it wouldn't matter too much. Okay, so I've done that. I'm just going to quickly dry that so I don't do what I usually do and stick my fingers in it and end up smudging it all over everything. And hopefully you can see some of these bubbles coming up now. And the final step is to take a white highlighter pen, and at the opposite side to where I've done my shadows, sort of down this side at the bottom. So I'm going to now go in and do the highlights at the top. And just looking to do a bit of an arch. If it doesn't work, just smudge it and go over and do it again. In fact, the smudging can make it look quite nice actually at times. And you're just almost making it look like the light's reflecting on the top of the bubbles. You could take your time doing this, or you could do what I'm doing and just fly through it and not really worry too much. Just a suggestion in the background. But hopefully you'll be able to see how that makes a lot of difference to the bubbles. It gives them so much more definition. So I love this stencil. I've used it on so many things, I think. And you can even pull out some of those really tiny bubbles in the background. You can bring those forward by adding highlights to them. So there you go. Hopefully that will give you an idea of how I made the card. I'll show you again the difference. So this was with using the, which one was that? Granite. So that was using the granite, and this was using the raspberry ice cream. And what I would do is probably turn it around that way so that the widest gap is at the bottom, or I could just trim it up so that it was slightly more central. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that that was clear how I did that, and that you'll be able to have a go and use the technique yourself. Thank you for watching. Bye.